I will be chatting with you today, and I'm do my best to divide the sessions into two subjects. The first one is a chat on culture and psychiatry, and I have something very specific in mind. And as you'll see, it's going to be really quite abstract and perhaps even a little tedious. And the tedium will be greatly relieved by any comments or objections that you have. Otherwise, I will just rattle on. Tomorrow, depending upon how far I get today, I would like to speak about emotion and cultural psychiatry, and I believe that's what you were told that I would be chatting about. Okay, so Virginia divided the handout into two parts, I believe, and there is one part, the thinner one, that says culture and psychiatry at the top. Okay, so if I could ask you to look at that, and certainly through the first part of today's session, that's what I will concentrate on. Okay, so we're all together. So before I begin, does anyone have a question? Is everything, we're all on the same way, no surprises yet, good. Okay, and if you look at the very top of it, already there's a kind of a confusion, a kind of proliferation of prepositions and conjunctives here. It says culture and psychiatry, culture in psychiatry, culture of psychiatry. And that makes me sound as if I'm a very indecisive person. I can't make my mind up. But I did make my mind up. But I want to make a distinction that I think is quite important for the two talks that I will be giving. That the subject of the summer program is obviously culture and psychiatry and how they go together. I want to make the argument that they can go together in at least three different ways, but I want to talk about only one of those ways today. One way in which they can fit together, culture and psychiatry, is that we are interested in psychiatry in various cultures, and the way that growing up and living within a particular culture is going to impact on the epidemiology of psychiatric disorders, on the kinds of interventions that are going to be appropriate and efficacious, and so on and so forth. In short, that culture and psychiatry is, I believe, what everybody here had in mind in subscribing to the course and wanting to come and to listen to the lectures. But there's another way that culture and psychiatry can fit together, and that is the extent to which culture permeates psychiatric practices in ways that are implicit and taken for granted. And I'm just going to touch on that a bit this afternoon when I talk a bit about the self. Anthropologists have been interested in both of these forms, culture and psychiatry, culture in psychiatry, and it's been a kind of a game, a kind of a gotcha game, where anthropologists believe that they have identified certain ethnocentric conceptions that psychiatrists take for granted, but actually are not universal, but are particular to a Western worldview, in fact, very often to an American worldview. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that, so that I won't belabor the point. And again, maybe I'll say a few words when it comes time to talk about the self. But there's a third way that they go together that perhaps has not occurred to you. Has not even occurred to some of my anthropological colleagues. And that is, as I have there, culture of psychiatry. And the notion here, the presumption here, is that just as the Zuni have a culture. And we call it the culture of the Zuni, or any other group have got the culture. We can even be very broad and say the culture of the French, or the culture of the Belgians, or whatever you want to say. And we all have a rough idea of what that means. I want to make the argument that psychiatry has a culture, and that we can talk about the culture of psychiatry. In fact, it's much more complicated than that, because that's already presuming that psychiatry is uniform around the world. And perhaps a better way of describing, as one of my colleagues, Woody Gaines, has, and to speak about the cultures of psychiatry. So that, and now I'm speaking not about indigenous psychiatry, but the kinds of psychiatry that are taught in residency programs around the world. And there are substantial differences from one culture, one nation to another. Now, very often there are important differences. Although, as time has gone on, and I want to say a few words about this, psychiatry has become progressively globalized. That is, those national differences have become less and less significant than they were in the past. My particular interest, as far as disorders go, is with post-traumatic syndromes. And I remember, this goes back to the late 1980s, not a tremendously long time ago, but in terms of psychiatry, a long time ago, I was invited several times to France, close colleagues there, to give talks on post-traumatic stress disorder. And my audience, by and large, loved the talks. And one reason they loved the talks is that they regarded them and the disorder as a hilarious disorder, not in terms of the pain and sorrow and misery of people who are diagnosed with PTSD, but they regarded it as the quintessential American disorder, and saw this as a talk that I was giving about Americans rather than about psychiatry. And I could understand what they were talking about, particularly at that time. French psychiatry was dominated, at least academic psychiatry, by a psychoanalytic perspective. It was very important. American psychiatry, Canadian psychiatry to a lesser extent, had emerged from a period of where psychoanalytic perspectives were dominant into a new one, the post-DSM-3 that I'll speak about. The French had not. And the presumption was, well, this was a difference that would endure for centuries, forever. As long as there are Frenchmen and Frenchwomen who are different from Americans, so would this tradition. Well, they were wrong. I'm sorry to say they were wrong, because now go back and really don't have much to say about PTSD that's particularly interesting to them and enlivens the audience. I have to talk about other things with regards to it. Okay, but my point is there still remain now, and in the recent past, even more importantly, important national traditions. Likewise, with regards to psychiatry. And I will just talk about that very briefly. Instead of I will make things complicated enough, I'm sure, not intentionally, but to try to keep things as simple as I can, I'm not going to talk about the cultures of psychiatry, and I'm going to pretend that globalization process that's well underway has already reached its completion, and there is a single international psychiatry. And I want to argue that psychiatry has a culture. It isn't that it's purged of all the national cultures. It retains a distinctive culture. And like all cultures, it is something that's dynamic. Dynamic, not in, as people say, dynamic. It sounds like a compliment. You say, wow, she's dynamic. It means that she doesn't fall asleep when you're talking to her. That's not what I mean by dynamic. By dynamic, I mean it's changing. It's fluid and changing over time. And that's the nature of All cultures, no cultures are stable, they change over time. And the change over time is not simply a product of technology and the accumulation of knowledge, but it's intrinsic to every culture to change in this way, and that's psychiatry. She said, wow, psychiatry as a culture. That's a very provocative statement that you're making. But tell me, Professor Young, I know you would not call me Professor Young, you should call myself that. But tell me, Professor Young, if that's true, I'm already a little confused. I don't know whether you're talking, when you say psychiatry, are you talking about clinical psychiatry, clinical practices, or are you talking about psychiatric science? That is if you're talking about clinical practices, I'm right with you. In fact, I believe this all the time. I'm glad to hear someone else say it, that psychiatry is a culture with regard to clinical practices. And I know this from my own experiences and blah, blah, blah. Well, you're right, clinical practice, that would be a good example, but that's not what I have in mind. I have in mind psychiatric science. That is to say, articles that appear in the most important research journals. The American Journal of Psychiatry, British Journal of Psychiatry, biological psychiatry, molecular psychiatry, and so on. All the International Journal of Epidemiology, all of them. That research, that too has got a distinctive culture. Now you say, well, is this something distinct to psychiatry and psychiatric science? You would not stand up before us and say, biological science has got a culture. But you're wrong, I would say it also has a culture. If I knew enough about quantum physics, I would say quantum physics has, I think I would say it, I don't know, but I'm not going to say it, has, but I believe it anyway, has a culture. You say, wow, that's really something. You can see this is part of must be a part of a kind of an imperial impetus within anthropology. Since anthropologists study culture, is that they want to show that anthropology goes everywhere and subsumes everyone, and so on. Well, it isn't. I have no vanity as an anthropologist that we've got to encapsulate the world. But I do believe that all sciences have got a culture. You say, well, I'm sorry I didn't know this before I took this session. I have to take this session. Can't do anything. Maybe I brought a magazine to read. Because this is obviously nonsense to say that every science has got a culture. This sounds like that kind of awful ultra-relativism where anything goes. Who is that philosopher? I had Berkeley long ago. Paul Feyerabend wrote a famous book, a very, very good philosopher called Against Method. And that's exactly what he argued. He argued that, sure, science has got a culture. Everything has got a culture, and in that sense, anything goes within any culture. And he had the hubris to compare psychiatry with zombie witchcraft, which I'm going to do too, but in a way a little bit different from the way that he did it. He said, well, there's really no difference between zombie witchcraft and psychiatry. A point that some other people have made, by the way. And that sounds very provocative. And there were some people who said that Feyerabend is right and that there were other people, the empiricists and positivists, and said that this is the crumbling of the foundations of Western civilization and so on and so forth. Well, I don't believe that everything goes. When I say and claim that psychiatric science has a culture and that all sciences have a culture, I'm not assuming what Feyerabend and his supporters were assuming. They were assuming that all cultures are equal. I'm not assuming that. I'm assuming that some cultures are very unequal. And one of the most unequalist, if I can use that word, of all cultures are the cultures of science. So to say that science has a culture, each science has got a culture, is in a sense to accept what is inevitable about the nature of human knowledge and the way in which we engage the world. But that's not also to accept the proposition that all cultures are equal. I believe that there are some cultures that are far more powerful and far more important in that sense than others. And one of those, for me, the most important, you pick and choose your own, but for me, I know which one it is. And that is the cultures of science, nearly every science. Okay, so having said that, having made my declaration and my disclaimer with regards to science, each science having a culture, I'm going to talk about the culture of psychiatric science. I want now to proceed. Of course, on the other side, people who claim that sciences do not have cultures, they're saying science is about reality. Science is not about making a world, but rather uncovering a world. And I think that verb, uncover, is the right word. That in terms of what we call positivist science, people who reject the idea that psychiatric science has, and there are many, 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 many psychiatrists who subscribe to this positivist view, they would say, no, that's not what science does. Science is not constructing reality or a reality. It's uncovering it. It's taking over what is covering it, what is obscuring it, and raising it into our consciousness. And the argument that I'm making, and again, it's not just one that I'm not making as an individual, but there are many philosophers, many psychiatrists. I know one psychiatrist who believes this. I just don't tell anyone. Okay? It's Lawrence Kiermaier. So there, I couldn't be in better company than Lawrence. That culture, that knowledge, the world is being made in this way. And my belief, and Lawrence's belief, and many other people, is that there's no alternative. That's the best that we can do. To the extent that everything that we know about the world is understood in terms of language and communicated through language, and that's only one part of it, this is what we have to accept. And it's some kind of supreme arrogance or hubris to imagine that we can rise. Everybody likes the idea. So, oh, we're just another animal amongst the animals, and we should not be too ethnocentric or anthropocentric and blah, 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 blah. And I believe that's true, that we're related. Human nature is part of nature and all that. But then they jump from that to presume that humans can have a kind of knowledge or understanding of the world that's equivalent to uncovering the world, whatever that would mean. Okay, I don't want to go rattle on with this, because philosophers have been talking very, very knowledgeably about this for many, many centuries. And the most famous person, I guess, or the most obvious one, was Kant, Immanuel Kant, who drew a distinction between what he called noumena and phenomena. Noumena are things in themselves. Phenomena are the way in which we understand them. And he says the problem with noumena from the point of view of human beings is that they're inexhaustible in their details. And in order for them to become meaningful, we've got to subtract from them. And that's turning from the noumena, things as they exist in themselves, to phenomena. Things that we understand and give meaning to already represents an act of some kind of a culture that's involved. Okay, I'm finished talking, maybe a little more concrete at this time. Now, there are a number of people who are immensely helpful for us in understanding this proposition that psychiatric science has a culture. I'm not going to make a list of all of them, but I'm going to name two of them, because I think they're the most important of all. The first of them was maybe three. The first of them was a virologist, a great biologist named Ludwig Fleck. And Fleck's active life was during the 1930s in Poland. And he was a Polish Jew, and you'll see that has part of the story is connected with this. And he was a very distinguished researcher and a member of the Polish Academy of Sciences and so on. So he could not go up any higher than he had gone as a scientist. And he wrote a wonderful book, not very fat, in English, called Origin and Genesis of a Scientific Fact. And it's about the Wassermann test for syphilis. Something he knew a lot about. You could say he was an ethnographer because he had studied, but he was a participant. He was an ethnographer. He was a participant observer in doing it, and so. And he wrote the book, and the book's really a marvelous book. And it was published in a small edition around 1935. And not so long afterwards, Poland was invaded. His book was published in Switzerland, could not be published in Germany, even though it was in German, because he was a Jew. So it was not read there. No one read it. Then the war began in 1939, and he and his family were sent to Auschwitz, where he was recognized by the Germans, by the Nazis, as someone not to be destroyed immediately, but to do research on typhus for them, which was afflicting German soldiers as they moved to the east. And he survived the war, returned to Poland, then was thrown out of Poland together with most of the Jews of Poland around 1956, went to Israel and died soon afterwards. Now, the reason I give you these biographical details is that his book was forgotten. Almost no one knew about this marvelous book that happened. There were very few copies around. And in the 1960s, Thomas Kuhn, and I'm sure he was the second person that I want to talk about, a man who had been a very accomplished physicist in the United States, and then who had become interested in the philosophy of science and history of science, and was writing a book that is regarded as a landmark study in what I'm calling the culture of science. And the title of the book was The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And perhaps some of you know this book. Really, whenever you see lists of the 10 great books of the 20th century, very often Kuhn's book is included. 10 most influential books. Kuhn's book is included there because Kuhn's thesis in that book is that scientific knowledge does not accumulate over time. There's not a gradient, not in terms of its power, but in terms of the actual way in which knowledge develops over time. It doesn't proceed by a continuous gradient, but goes through a series of revolutions, not many revolutions. And each of those revolutions transforms the vision of the world that science has had. They're not trivial. It is a world transforming. Everything before that revolution now becomes, in a sense, irrelevant, hard to even translate. He used the word incommensurable. You can't even, to be incommensurable means that there's no set of standards by which you can compare the two of them. He said, well, science is like that. Goes through these revolutions, not many of them. And in physics, I don't know, he says, maybe 3. So it's not, it doesn't happen very often, but it happens. Well, that was a revolutionary, not only in the title revolutionary, it was a revolutionary proposition because it suggested that each science at a particular point in time, what you call normal science, and a normal science, would people accept that science to be? Will we accept quantum physics to be today? Or psychiatric science and so on. So you describe it as normal science, that standards people accept it and so on. That each normal science has a distinctive culture, and he even gave a name that we have for it, and you all know the name, maybe you didn't know. It was Kuhn who popularized it, and that's the term paradigm. And he said that each of these cultures has a paradigm, and a paradigm is a distinctive way of solving a puzzle, the puzzles that are particular to that science. But even more interesting than being a significant way to solve the puzzles that are intrinsic to that science, it is also a paradigm, a way of defining exactly what a puzzle is. And we take that for granted. The puzzles fall out of the sky, like the apples fall off of trees. But puzzles don't. I mean, that's one of the problems with science, or scientists will tell you, researchers will tell you, and that is to discover new puzzles in a way. So the idea that what constitutes a puzzle, what constitutes a solution, what constitutes a proof, what constitutes evidence, what constitutes an outcome of an experiment, where that outcome ends. All of these questions are aspects of the paradigm, and a paradigm is like very similar to a culture. So that was his argument in the book. Not only was it influential, important, it really created a revolution in the way in which science is generally understood today. Now, when he was writing the book, and he wrote the book, and he was invited to travel around the world and to give lectures, people had heard about him. He came to Germany, and he gave a lecture on his theory about scientific revolutions. And someone came up to him at the end of the lecture. It was just a wonderful lecture, absolutely terrific. But you know, someone said this before you. And he said, well, no, actually, I didn't know that someone said this before me. Actually, two people had. One was a Frenchman, Gaston Bachelard, who is a physicist. We'll leave him aside. We'll talk about epistemic ruptures. But the person the German had in mind was Fleck. And he said to Kuhn, he said, do you read German? Fleck. And Kuhn said, well, of course I do. He said, oh, good. I'll give you my book. And you read it, and you decide for yourself. And Kuhn read it and was just overwhelmed by it. Not humiliated that he was number two, but was overwhelmed by the book. Immediately brought it back to the United States, the University of Chicago Press, where I had published his book, and said, you've got to publish this book. This is enormous. Have it translated and published, which is exactly what they did. So there are two people, Kuhn and Ludwig Fleck, first of all, and then Kuhn. Kuhn with regards to paradigms of physics, Fleck with regards to paradigms of infectious disease. The third person, thank goodness, is still alive and vigorous. And even, I was going to say even better than that. So you can't say better than being alive, right? So I take that back. Almost as good as that. He's a Canadian. And that is Ian Hacking. And perhaps some of you know Hacking. Hacking is one of the most famous philosophers of science today. A professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, I'm very happy to say, has been many occasions at McGill as a guest in my department in the Faculty of Medicine to give lectures, and also the Collège de France. And Hacking has written about this. And if you're interested in pursuing this subject in any way, I recommend that you can skip over the Fleck. It's not so easy to read, and the Kuhn, and go immediately to Hacking, who's a marvelous writer and very good. Okay, now Fleck coined a term for what I'm calling a culture. And it's a wonderful term, very 1930-ish term. It's a German term. And he said, well, this culture that we're talking about, that I'm talking about, the culture of a science and the culture of sciences, we can call it a Denkstil, a thought style. And this is translated into English as a style of thinking, a style of reasoning. Very much like, again, Kuhn's notion of what a paradigm is. And this notion of a Denkstil, or a style of reasoning, it comes very close to what anthropologists mean by culture. Now, the problem is with some people is they stop there. Oh, it's absolutely wonderful. I love that term. It's good. I'm glad it's not English, and now I can really impress people who don't speak German and to talk about a Denkstil. It's not enough. It's not enough, because that's not all that he spoke about. He spoke about it in the context of something else, and they go together. You can't talk about one without the other. And in a way, this is one of the subtlest points that he is making, and one of the, by far the most important, and a point that both Kuhn and Hacking likewise develop. And the second term is a Denkkollektiv. Now, this notion about a collective, already we've got this, makes Fleck sound like a Bolshevik, writing in the 1930s. But his idea of a collective was pretty much what anthropologists think about as a society, as people interacting with one another, of there being different roles with regards to each other, of differential power, and blah. Well, you get the idea of what he was talking about. And his argument was that every science also has got a social organization. And this social organization is going to be characteristic of that, although it will be shared amongst sciences. And I won't belabor the point what that Denkkollektiv is like, except to make one tremendously important point that he is making. He said, if you want to talk about a style of reasoning, a Denkstil, what people immediately think is that you're talking about a mentality. That is to say, what goes on in the mind of a scientist. That's the style of reasoning, and that's responsible for... Fleck says, absolutely not. A Denkstil is a style of reasoning of a collectivity, not of an individual. We want to think about it as being an individual, but that is a profoundly unscientific way to think about what goes on in science. It is not the work of the mind of a single individual. That's what we get when we turn on the boob tube. They always have a great mind, you know. We're waiting for the next genius. Well, it's not a single mind. Albert Einstein didn't exist as Albert Einstein by himself the way Robinson Crusoe did. He existed as a member of a Denkkollektiv within physics that had journals, that had institutions, and so on and so forth. So if you want to use the term mind and think about mind, it's a collective mind. It's a collective consciousness, but not in any spooky, mystical way of a collective consciousness, but in a very concrete, materialistic way of a variety of people and institutions who are interacting with one another in various ways and funding themselves and so on and so forth. So you get the idea. Hacking just takes the same ideas over. He does not claim originality. He says, I'm just going to formalize it a little, and he adopts a term very close to Fleck's term, and that is style of reasoning. So I'll talk about a style of reasoning, but when I talk about style of reasoning, remember I'm talking about both of these things, the Denkkollektiv and the Denkstil. Okay? So I hope that I haven't made this confusing. Now, if you look on this sheet, the first sheet, what I've done is I've put on page number 1 all of the elements of a style of reasoning. Let's say the style of reasoning of psychiatric science. Okay, has got all of these things that are all connected up with one another in a meaningful way to produce knowledge, and not only to produce knowledge, but also to produce interventions. Because Hacking, in a very early book of his, had a wonderful title, and the title was Representing and Intervening. And representing means the way in which science represents the world. Whether it's psychiatric science representing mental disorders, or whatever it is, these are representations. Words are representations. Journal articles are representations. The clinical engagements are, in a sense, representations. But the title, remember, is Representations and Interventions. And his notion is that science does not simply represent the world, but it intervenes in the world. And in intervening, it changes the world in various ways and is connected up in a kind of a loop. So it's not just, it's a term, if I could use the word now, it's already disappearing with Freud from the collective consciousness, that Marx made a big deal about when he used the term praxis, P-R-A-X-I-S, praxis. And Marx's notion, not unique to Marx, is that we know the world not passively, but actively, through engaging it. And that's what Hacking meant by representing and intervening. So, although I've listed all of these, the elements that Hacking lists here, it's a very boring list. And one reason that it's a boring list is that it's minus the Denkkollektiv, that is minus all the institutions and the people and the backbiting and the search for grants, and you figure it out, governments and so on. With regards to it, that's missing, and also the interventions are missing. So this is, the world is three-dimensional. This is barely one dimension that but it's okay. We can at least look through what he has, what he suggests that we have to consider. And please, I ask you to be patient. I'm not going to just go down the list and say, well, that's a list. If you really must remember it, and walk around with a little book and waiting in line to see if you remember all 9 points. But rather, some of the points really are important and worth looking at. And there you see what they are, that he makes ideas, technologies, objects, institutions, narratives, and proofs are each down there. Okay, I'll let you read these at your own leisure, but I want to say a few words about a couple of these points that he's making. First of all, and the points that are tremendously important for psychiatric science and for understanding the culture of psychiatry. And the first of these, really, just 2 points I think I want to make, has to do with the ideas. He says, each Denkkollektiv has got, each Denkstil has some characteristic ideas. And of course, when we hear this term, thought style, we think thought style is only about ideas. And Hacking says, no, don't make that mistake. It's not only about ideas. Look down. It includes technologies. It includes apparatuses. And indeed, embedded in those apparatuses are ideas. And they're the worst kind of ideas, not that they're bad ideas, but they're taken for granted ideas. And often we're unaware of the assumptions that we are making just by virtue of using particular technologies. And I'll come talk a bit about that. However, there are ideas. And amongst these ideas, maybe the most interesting one for us of all, the easiest to grasp in terms of this way of looking at the culture of psychiatry, is classifications. And Hacking quite rightly makes the point that there is no science that engages the world without first making classifications. That is to say, making distinctions amongst the phenomena that come into, with which it is engaged. Those classifications are immensely important. And for me, we could have had this summer program in which we did nothing, not just in my session, all the sessions, did nothing except focus on classification. I mean, classification, again, sounds like one of these topics that's so intrinsically boring. And it can be boring. Anything, well, not anything can be boring. A lot of things can be boring. But classifications aren't boring. And within psychiatry, they're enormously, obviously enormously, can be enormously important. You'll see why I'm hesitating when I say it. For us today, 2012, they're immensely. Imagine, for example, suddenly someone, I don't know, comes down, has one of these sprays over and decides to test the CIA or someone. You know, a plane flies over and it's an aerosol and we all smell, and this aerosol affects our memories. But just one specific tiny part of our memories, and that part is DSM-4. Everything that we know. So it's not terribly bad. Well, they always start off with little things anyway, you know that. So that's why you have to be careful. You say, well, who cares? This is one little, it's not a big deal. But imagine that that's what they did. They had whoever it was who came. Rupert Murdoch, if you don't want to. Maybe that's better today, more appropriate. I don't think the CIA is up to it, but you know, maybe News of the World is up to it, or used to be. In any event, that everything that we know about DSM-4 and its predecessors, 3R and 3, forget about the ones before that, were suddenly erased. How would that affect psychiatry today? Psychiatric science and clinical psychiatry. And as we all know, we said, my God, I mean, that would be like pushing us back 2,000 years, 3,000 years. I don't know how far back, because there have been classifications. But how can we talk without classifications? I mean, sounds like that. Who is that guy you were talking about? Immanuel Kant. That is a reversion from phenomena, that is the way the classifications work, to noumena, where the world is overwhelming in its details, and because it's overwhelming in its details, it's completely unmanageable. There can't be any intervention. We don't know what we're intervening against. So there's no arguing that classifications are, in many cases, of tremendous importance. Now, if that is true, a good question to ask ourselves, whatever our background is, whatever our interest is in psychiatry, as long as we have an interest in culture and psychiatry, is to ask the question, where do those classifications come from? Where do the classifications of psychiatry come from? Long time ago, there was a book, actually the book was first published before World War II, and then there were many editions, or several editions, after World War II. It was a wonderful book. I would ask my undergraduate students when I teach a course like this to read the book first. And the title was 1066 and All That by Sears and Yateman. And what it was purported to be, it was British authors, and what it purported to be was a book of examination questions and answers for students in public schools, private schools and so on, within history of Great Britain. But the history of Great Britain as it's remembered by a not terribly bright schoolboy 10 years later. And it's really quite wonderful. And I remember many of the questions and answers, but only one of them is appropriate now. And remember what the question is that it's easy for me to lose track of what I'm saying. I guess it's even easier for you. But I posed the question. And the question is, where do these classifications, DSM-4, 3R, 3, where did they come from? And I think that most of us think in the way that the schoolboy in 1066 and all that does, because there's one exam question that he has to answer. And remember, this is written in the days of the British Empire when people cared about questions like this. And the question is, what was the cause of the Second Afghan War? And in fact, there was the British fought one in around 1830s, then one in the 1800s. What was the cause of the Second Afghan War? And while you scratch your head, what was it? It had something to do with the Russians, and it had something to do with the Northwest frontier. And while you're thinking about all that, you gaze down and you see what the real answer is. And the real answer is, does anyone know? The First Afghan War, exactly. And, okay, you say, well, that makes things nice. And remember, who's thinking about this? He can't remember the answer, and he thinks, because of the Second Afghan War, it's the First Afghan War. So you say, what is the cause of DSM-4 system of classification? You got it, DSM-3R, and DSM-3R, DSM-3. And before that, well, it's like the story about the Chinese used to say about the Earth being in space on the back of a turtle. And you say, well, that's a great theory about what holds the Earth in the sky. But what's the turtle standing on? And the answer, he's standing on another turtle. And the question is, well, what's he standing on? Said, don't worry, there are turtles all the way down. Well, a lot of times people think of classifications that way. And again, this is a very anti-Kuhnian way of looking at science. They've always been there. We're tinkering, improving, blah, blah, all the way up. But that was not true. There was, and we're lucky in psychiatry because there was a big revolution. And the big revolution was not long ago. We don't have to go back 2 centuries. We don't have to go back to Copernicus and getting rid of the Ptolemaic system. Goes back to 1980, and it goes back to DSM-3 and the DSM-3 revolution. And it really was a revolution, just in the way that Kuhn said a revolution would occur. It's a revolution in which the whole world is transformed. That is to say, the world of mental disorders and mental illnesses and so on and so forth. So this idea of just a regression of turtles all the way down was not true. In DSM-3, there's a real discontinuity. And it's a discontinuity that was recognized at the time. There was, to use this word revolution, and people sometimes use it in a way, for cereal. It's a revolution in breakfast cereals. And you look at it, it's the same old thing. They just have a different box. It's but a real revolution is really a revolution. That's why it's a word that frightens a lot of us, because we know what the revolution means. It really means some fundamental changes. And with regards to the DSM-3 revolution, it really was that. It was that not only in which the world was turned upside down, but institutions were turned upside down. The apparatuses, the technologies, the interventions, everything was turned upside down. And the DSM-3 was part of that revolution, but it was an indispensable part of the revolution. And I'm sure that many of you, I hope not too many, know the story of the DSM-3 revolution. It's been chronicled by many people. I have in a book that I wrote, and what it was like, and the way in which it began. One way in doing it, making it very simple, was that in post-war psychiatry, post-World War II psychiatry in the United States was dominated by psychoanalytic perspectives. And we get to around 1985, a survey was made of heads of departments in academic programs in psychiatry, medical schools in the United States. And one of the questions that was asked was of the chairman, and they were all men, there were no chair people then, they were all chairmen, and to ask what their training had been in psychiatry, what they had done their residency program in. And 85% of them had done a training analysis, that is in psychoanalysis. Now, that's not to say that they remain loyal to psychoanalysis, but it does give an idea of the extent to which a psychoanalytic perspective permeated the Denkstiel of certainly of clinical psychiatry at that time. And there were some people who were very unhappy with that. There were some people who were very unhappy with psychoanalysis from even before psychoanalysis, from the 19th century. And one of those people was Emil Kraepelin. And I'm sure that many of you know Emil Kraepelin, very famous German psychiatrist. And Emil Kraepelin was writing, I think, at Heidelberg. And Emil Kraepelin was very discontent with the status of psychiatry. And he was an active psychiatrist, I mean, treating many, many patients, the head of a department, very important guy about it. And what disappointed him was that when he looked around in medicine, this is still to some extent true, looked around in medicine amongst the various departments of medicine, in faculties of medicine, the most marginal, peripheral, the one treated with the least respect was psychiatry. And the one excuse that psychiatrists made for themselves at the time is, well, we're dealing with something that is so complex. Other people are dealing with things that are so simple that you can't expect us to be quite up to speed with everyone else. Kraepelin said, well, yeah, we are dealing with something that's tremendously complex, the human mind and the human brain, but that's not enough. The big difference between us and them is if we go back 50 years and compare ourselves at the beginning of the 19th century with other branches of medicine, they weren't so different from what psychiatry is now. But what's happened to them is they've transformed themselves. Particularly, and remember when he's writing, the 1880s, the golden age of infectious disease, and particularly the work of Koch, and with these enormous developments taking place in infectious disease, with tremendous payoffs with regards to morbidity and mortality. And he says, not only have we never had a golden age, we're never going to have a golden age. And the reason that we're not going to have a golden age is that we never started off, we aren't in a position, rather, that infectious disease was before, at the beginning of their golden age. And that is the system of classification. And he says what the system of classification would be. He said, we're just so full of people who've got such a passion for etiologies and explanations. Everybody knows, every psychiatrist you ask, he's got an explanation for what causes the problems that he sees. And he said, you know, we began exactly at the wrong end. We picked up the wrong end of the stick. You don't begin with etiologies and explanations. What you begin with are classifications. What you begin with are collecting information in a very empirical way, just on the basis of observations, and also that you do this both synchronically, that is at one point of time, to look at a particular phenomenon, a particular case, whatever it is, and you also look at it diachronically. That is to say, what its course is, what its life course is over the time. He said, in psychiatry, this is really important because I know as a clinician that you have great, with certain individuals, you have great undulations. They look as if they're getting better. There's a remission of symptoms. Then there's a recurrence of the symptoms, or maybe a period in between of even years, and blah, 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 blah. So he said, you have to do this meticulously. And so he kept all these little cards with his patients, and would come back and would have people working under him collect this. Well, you get the idea of what he was talking about. It was called the Kreplinian approach, an empirical approach. And his argument was, eventually, we will get to the point of being able to talk about causes, about etiologies. But first of all, we have to have the classifications. And we simply don't have them. It's not only that we don't have a uniform set, we don't have any. And this is what we've got to focus on. Now, fast forward 100 years, a century, to around 1980 in the United States. And there is, at this time, in one university, one medical school, and it really is a case of one, expressing the discontents within psychiatry, and that is the Washington University in St. Louis. And in that department, it was a very distinctive department at that time, and the chair of the department, Eli Robbins, he was married to an epidemiologist, Lee Robbins, and Sam Gouzet. There were a number of very famous people, now very famous people, and highly respected then, who wanted to break out. They had read Kraepelin. Kraepelin had inspired them. Not Kraepelin. Kraepelin, talking about the Kraepelinian method, Kraepelin had one enormous success. Anyone know what it was? It was with regards to schizophrenia and with regards to identification of dementia praecox. The Bloiler then goes on and develops. So that there was a payoff. At least from our perspective, with regards even of Kraepelin's work. In any event, at Washington University, they got it into their heads that what is needed now is a crusade of some kind, really a crusade, a political movement within American psychiatry to transform psychiatric classification. And they were able to get support within the National Institute of Mental Health, and part of their aid came from a renegade psychoanalyst who came from Columbia University to Washington University, made a pilgrimage to be amongst the neo-Kraepelinians. And that was Robert Spitzer, who's still around, still very active and energetic today, has some second thoughts, but in any event, about this. He came, he joined them, and they mobilized political allies. Political allies within the American Psychiatric Association, within the National Institutes of Mental Health, but also in third-party insurers. You say, now you're making the story too complicated. I like stories about psychiatry and what goes on with psychiatry and the different departments and so on. Leave the insurance out. They're really not so. This is one of the biggest parts of this story. Has to do with insurance and has to do with pharma, with big pharma. And I'm not saying this in a negative way. This isn't what I'm saying. This is the point where Allan Young starts bringing in the villains. Great. There are no villains in this story. It's all part of a Dent collective, as you're about to see. In any event, what they're mobilizing this time is they want a transformation. They don't want to be humiliated any longer within their schools of medicine. They don't want to be the eighth choice when fourth-year medical students apply for residency programs and they put dermatology 1 and psychiatry 10. Now, what a humiliation. We want to be at least number 4, 3, not number 10. with regards to. So to have a mission, real interest in going in, ultimately they are successful. And one wonderful document to read, it's not very long to read, is to read the editorial introduction to DSM-3. And it's by Robert Spitzer. And after hearing what I've said about Kraepelin, it could have been written by Kraepelin. In fact, one could say, wanted to be a little bit funny, that at this point Spitzer was channeling Kraepelin. Because it is a completely Kraepelinian view of this. The whole thing about etiologies, the whole thing about symptomatology comes right out of Kraepelin with regards to it. Now, the story's interesting. You say, wow, this is good. I thought we were going to have a terrible lecture. And now he's coming in, he's telling us stories. I'm completely lost track of all the stuff about Den Collective and Denkstiel, but I haven't. As you're going to see, this is not just a painless way, it's, I think, the most meaningful way of being able to talk about these things and talking about scientific revolutions and so on. What happened in the years leading up, and it's just a couple of years, leading up to 1980 with the publication of DSM-3, is that there's a tremendous, what shall I call it? I'll call it a Kulturkampf, a battle of cultures, because that's exactly what it is, and that's the way it was described at the time. It is a battle between cultures, between the neo-Kraepelinians on the one hand, and the psychoanalysts on the other hand. Remember I said this, there was a very, very important presence within American psychiatry of a psychoanalytic perspective. And there is a Kulturkampf. You say, what kind of Kulturkampf could this be? Well, it's one of the most profound sort of all. The psychoanalysts object, and I remember at the time reading this, I could not make any sense out of this half of the argument. And because what the psychoanalyst objection was an objection to a system of classifications. You say, oh my God, what do you mean who could object to a system of classifications? I said, no. This is absolutely antithetical to psychiatry. We can't have a system of classifications. And if you look at what the Kraepelinian system is, it is one that is based on symptom lists. We all know what the DSMs look like. You know, you've got the symptom list. He says it's based on a series of symptom lists. This is completely unscientific. In fact, it's not just unscientific, it's anti-scientific. This is the most bizarre proposal that, and I remember reading it, well, what conceivably could they be talking about? Here are medical men, and they're talking about a diagnostic system as being it could have the wrong diagnostic criteria. That wasn't what they were arguing about. The diagnostic criteria were incorrect. They were arguing against diagnostic criteria per se, that there should be diagnostic criteria. So it sounds absolutely bizarre. It's not bizarre. Don't use that word. Not yet. The word you should talk like Thomas Kuhn. I know you may not want to, but if you did want to, you would not use the word bizarre, you would use the word incommensurable. And incommensurable means that you can't measure them against each other. They're talking about two completely different orders of things in this regard. These are two incommensurable, not just views of psychiatry, but views of the mind and views of the world. Now, what was wrong with the psychoanalysts? Well, there was nothing wrong. Kuhn says, don't use that word wrong. It was different. It was a different paradigm with regards to them. They advocated the primacy of an etiology. You say you begin with an etiology, you don't begin with symptoms. How could they say that? Well, they could say it once you cross back into psychoanalysis. It makes perfectly good sense. It is a reflection of one of the foundational principles of psychoanalysis. And it is the principle of polymorphic perversity. You say, well, great, I'm interested in learning about any kind of perversity. I don't know that one, but it's the least interesting, I think, okay. But I'll tell you what it is. Polymorphic perversity is, as the name would suggest, poly, many, morphic, expressions, bodies, perversity, and has to do with the notion of a neurosis. And Freud's argument, which was an old one, was not too unique to him, is that what a neurosis is an adaptation to an underlying conflict, is a way of adapting. And that the symptoms that emerge as a result of, it's an adaptation, but it's also a maladaptation. The costs are greater than the benefits, and the cost includes symptoms of various kinds. And that these symptoms are very troublesome. The problem is that lifting those symptoms, eliminating those symptoms, is not a great problem. We've been able to do this for years. And what Freud had in mind, especially, was hypnosis. We can use hypnosis. He was using hypnosis, then gave it up. And other people were to lift symptoms. You say, lift symptoms. That's no big deal. You can even teach people and can lift symptoms. The problem is that the underlying conflict remains. The effort to adapt to the conflict remains. And this will be expressed symptomatically in a different way. And that's what the notion of polymorphic perversity is that these symptoms change over time, influenced by environmental factors. And that you can hardly talk about a cure just by lifting symptoms, because you leave the fundamental underlying, well, you get the idea of what it is. I don't want to go into any more details, but if you understand this rather simple principle, then you can understand why a system of classification based on symptomatology just doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense because it doesn't tell you. It's an illusion that you have created with these symptom lists. So they said, that's why I'm so glad that I can express myself so articulately. We don't need DSM-3. We should forget about these neo-Kreplinians, these heretics, and just ignore this, to ignore this term. Finish with regards to it. Now, it's interesting how the neo-Kreplinians, who became a majority, just one moment, so I can say, what the neo-Kreplinians said in response. And it is, again, very interesting in the context of understanding what a Denkstil and a Denkkollektiv is, how subtle and interesting these notions are. And I'm about to tell you, and I know that you're very eager to turn the page and to see what the response is of the neo-Kreplinians. Okay, so what was the response at this point of Spitzer? And again, like with a really good revolution, these were dedicated fanatics on both sides. Oh, that's too strong a word, but they were quite nasty to each other. And there had been a convention of the American Psychiatric Association in 1979 in Washington, where DSM-3 was debated, because it had to be adopted by the American Psychiatric Association. It's not just someone gets the idea, goes to McGill Queen's University Press and said, will you publish DSM-3? They say, yeah, sure, looks interesting. That's not how it happens. It was adopted. It was a document. It's like a constitution. It's exactly what it was. Because the notion of adopting it meant, amongst other things, if it were adopted, this would become a standard. And it would become a standard for programs of psychiatry throughout the United States. And would transform. Once adopted, whatever transformative effect it would have would be for the United States altogether. Now you say, how can you do that? Who has got the power to give a diktat and say this point? It's very easy. If in fact the American Psychiatric Association did make that decision, They likewise made the decision with regards to licensing. And they also made the decision with regards to testing. That is, how do people qualify for a license as a practicing psychiatrist? What do they have to know in those tests in order to qualify? And do they have to know about, well, you get the idea. If in fact they've got to know everything about DSM-3 and they're given problems they've got to solve with regards to DSM-3 and blah, 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 this then becomes a very important element. It also becomes at that point, or Spitzer hopes, it will become a lingua franca. That is a language for everyone to speak to everyone else. Because at this time, 1979, there already were several systems of classification. And that was one of the problems. There was already one in DSM-2, based upon notions of neurosis. So it was not very helpful. But the Department of the Army, U.S. Army, had a psychiatric nosology that they used for diagnosing soldiers. It was different from DSM-2. It was also different from the Department of the Navy. They had, which is not a surprise, that the Navy had a different nosology for psychiatric well, you can get there. It was a kind of chaos around a balkanization of psychiatric classification around the United States. However, and there had been no impetus before that to have a uniform one, a standard one. If in fact there is a standard one, this then, and is predicated upon licensing and so on and so forth, so it becomes very powerful. Okay, the idea here, or that I want to impress upon you, is that here you have a set of ideas, a classification, but it's not only ideas, it's not only a Denkstil, it's also a Denkkollektiv. The only way that those ideas became real is because they were embedded within an institution and adopted by that institution, and then put into certain institutional practices that had to do with licensing and not only with regards to licensing, but even more or as significant with regards to publications. Because on adoption of the DSM-3 system, this then becomes a standard, not only for psychiatric education, but also a standard for publication in the most important psychiatric journals. So that everything has got to be transformed into the language of the DSM if it's going to be published within a psychiatric journal. Not everybody has to do this. You can publish in psychoanalytic journals, but you cannot publish in the mainstream ones. So you see, institutionally, everything is being connected up in this way. Well, the psychoanalysts understood this very well. They were not dopes, understood everything that was happening and how they were being threatened, how their whole world was being undermined and changed and reality transformed and so on, treatment of patients and so on. But there was more to that. And they responded again. They made this argument that intellectually it was vacuous, it's a step back to the 18th century, not even to the 19th century. Spitzer then took up the cudgel and he said to them, the reason that you object so much, this was a wonderful argument, the reason that you object so much has to do with medical insurance. Remember I made the point about medical insurance. And the United States does not have what we have here. That is to say, a government insurance, national insurance, provincial insurance. Payment for psychiatry was greatly dependent on payments by third parties, by insurance companies. Insurance companies became the most important allies of the neo-Kraepelinians. And the reason that they became the allies is that if in fact we have a set of a standardized nosology, what we can do now is compare outcomes amongst different classes of practitioners. We could not do it before, again, because of this incommensurability, polymorphic perversity, and all of that. We can do it now. We can do it. If we have this standardized, what we can do is we can compare. And what we are interested in comparing is how much does it cost? How much does it cost for a psychoanalyst to treat someone with a diagnosis and someone for one of these cognitive behavioral therapists of Aaron Beck's stripe at the University of Pennsylvania who claim that they can do it. And that they can do it in 4 weeks in group meetings once a week, as opposed to psychoanalysis, and we can compare it. And Spitzer said, that's what they're waiting to do. They're standing here in the wings, the insurance companies, and they're all waiting to do it. And once we have DSM-3, they can come to a decision. And they're not going to say you can't go to a psychoanalyst. Sure you can. You can go to them 4 times. And we will pay for each of these visits, I don't know, $50, whatever it is, because that's what we pay to the CBT people with regards to it. So you can see that this argument, the birth of this new vision of psychiatric disorders is being determined by all sorts of factors that are involved, about apparatuses and blah, 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 blah. But I've left one out. I've left out part of when I spoke about technologies and so on and so on. I left one very important one out. Because remember I spoke about pharma and the interest of pharmaceutical companies. In fact, the DSM-3 revolution is preceded by another kind, if not a revolution, of fluorescence. Something really big is happening within psychiatry, psychopharmacology. And it's in the 1950s, and it begins with an antipsychotic drug at that time in France, the trade name of Thorazine. And what was interesting about Thorazine and the efficacy of Thorazine, today we would describe as a major sedative, is that its effect seemed to be quite specific for schizophrenia, for people diagnosed with schizophrenia. Very soon after that was the advent of lithium therapy. And lithium therapy, as I'm sure you all know, is highly specific for bipolar disorder. Very soon after that were the monoamine oxidase inhibitors for depression. And again, at that time, looking back from 2012, this is all quite, I shouldn't say hilarious, it's not funny, but ironical. But at that time, that too seemed to be highly specific. So what these so-called drug discoveries were so interesting in this respect was that they seemed to be highly specific for symptoms and a vindication of the neo-Kraepelinian perspective. So again, and just one more little bit, then I won't bombard you with all the different factors that are then involved in what's going on, is that no one knew then or now how they work. That is, they were completely empirical discoveries, not theoretical discoveries, not predicated on ideology. And we still don't know how they're working. I have theories and so on, but in any event, things have not changed that much. Again, a vindication of this transformed view of the world that was being proposed with regards to DSM-3. That really made it a revolution. And in fact, the revolution ends, as every good revolution, not nice revolution, successful revolution, ends with a winner and a loser. And the loser was psychoanalysis. And the winner was, who was the winner? Watch it, you don't know. Because the real winner in all of this, that I've left out, is psychiatric epidemiology. Because it was psychiatric epidemiology which shaped from the beginning with the so-called Fegner criteria, the pilot study for DSM-3, it was the world seen through the lens of epidemiology, which was profoundly different than the world seen through the eyes of a psychoanalytically inclined clinician. It is a world seen in terms of standards of reliability and specificity, the aggregation, blah, 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 everything that you know and take for granted today about epidemiology. Epidemiology, again, wasn't like an apple that fell out of a tree. It is something that very slowly matured over time and transformed itself over time. Had people who were interested and advocates and blah, 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 the whole sort of everything that is involved in it. And if you want to have a single word to describe the world that is created and that we live with today in the post-DSM-3 world, that word is epidemiology. And again, I'm not, no villains here. Not if you're an ethnographer. You can't afford to have villains. Everybody is the same. But again, you can see that the epidemiology is organized in terms of completely without a theory. Talk about no theories. And is predicated on a highly, highly distinctive methodology and technology and the way in work. And it is a technology, even though it may be, well, protocol's not a technology, questionnaire scale's not a technology. Well, of course it's a technology of a very profound sort. So there's a very specific technology that's now brought, well, you get the idea of what's going on here. It's a very complicated system that's being, now some of you, I know that too, everybody's eager to have a cup of coffee. But before we go, with regards to remember what in fact, I shouldn't mention coffee. Now I've forgotten. But in any event, okay. I think that you can see the point that I was making about how everything is connected. Let's have coffee or whatever you want, or just stay.